Welcome. I'm going to answer the question of why Schools of Conscience is building the nurturing capacity of K-12 schools. My answer to that question begins with a confession. As I was growing up in public schools, I became a faux achiever. Did you ever just go through the motions without mastering the material? That's faux achievement. The majority of people who get degrees are faux achievers. The embodiment of this attitude shown in this thought bubble is how Hollywood depicts the outcasts and the delinquents in school movies. The outcasts and delinquents that can be saved are still physically engaged in school, but they're intellectually disengaged from their classwork until, of course, the right teacher shows up. All the inner city kids living in poverty, in the movies at least, face horrible lives of despair, death, unless they're saved by a nice white lady, nice white guy, badass black guy, or badass white lady, or creative Latino guy. Dropping out of school is complete disengagement, so it's too late for a school teacher to save them. And faux achievement, the shame of my schooling, is emotional disengagement, which is mostly invisible, so Hollywood has a hard time showing it. The physical attitude of the outcasts and delinquents is the most visually compelling manifestation of disengagement. For teachers, disengagement starts with toxic stress, which is disengagement from themselves, becomes burnout, which is disengagement from their students, and finally they quit, which is of course disengagement from the school. There is, in fact, an epidemic of disengagement in the real world of schooling. The Carnegie Foundation issued a report in 2015 that recognizes that this is a pervasive problem, and also notes that it is an eminently solvable one. In fact, they suggest that the engagement gap is more solvable than the achievement gap, even though they are only referring to dropouts and underachievers. Howard Gardner of Harvard University, in his book The Unschooled Mind, referred to a raft of research showing that a clear majority of people with bachelor's, master's, and doctorate degrees, who are supposed to be getting the most benefit from the system, are faux achievers because they get basic questions in their field wrong when they're presented in ways that are not on tests. Faux achievement is the most pervasive system of the disengagement epidemic, and also the most ignored. It continues to be off the radar of media, despite the work of psychologists that Gardner cited, and efforts to raise awareness dating back to 1987 by a coalition of the National Science Foundation, Public Broadcasting, Annenberg, Harvard, and the Smithsonian. They didn't have a name for it. They also didn't realize how it was related to dropouts and underachievement, nor did they realize it was part of an epidemic. Fortunately, we now know it is, and we also know how to prevent epidemics. Dr. Gary Slutkin, who fought epidemics in refugee camps in Africa for a decade, gave a TED-Med talk in 2013 that explained how he applied the three main principles of epidemiology to the behaviors of violence in the roughest neighborhoods in Chicago. The first principle is that you interrupt the immediate transmission behaviors in order to contain existing infections. The second principle is to prevent further spread through a population by altering the behaviors that lead to transmission. This is the beginning of prevention in the immediate vicinity of the highest risk populations. The final principle is to change the context of the behaviors, that is, change the norms of the people in the areas that are affected, so that the problem is prevented in a more systematic way. Now we can apply these same techniques for fighting the epidemic of disengagement. The first principle is applied by educating the adults on the role of nurturing as the proper foundation for education. There are clear behavioral guidelines that can help teachers know what to do in regards to nurturing in schools. They need to know how to distinguish their own nurturing behaviors from non-nurturing behaviors, and how those behaviors do or do not help them achieve their goals and purposes. Applying the second principle has to start with gathering the right kind of data to know what is actually going on in each learning community. So, to borrow a reform trope, we need to use a data-driven approach, but very important, we need to gather the right data. We do not need academic data. We don't need any more of that. We need data about well-being on a regular basis. Well-being data will provide insights for reducing the negative patterns and preserving the positive ones. The research has clearly shown that the drivers of non-nurturing behaviors are located more outside the classroom than inside it, and norms are the key. The third principle is both the beginning and the end of our process because we have a policy framework called Nurturing is the Foundation that schools can use to push both their management and teaching practices in the right direction. The policy explicitly defines and acknowledges the importance of nurturing in education and can serve as the focal point of a community discussion to shift the norms. So, this brings me to the answer to the question. We are building the nurturing capacity of K-12 schools in order to fight the epidemic of disengagement that is currently preventing the proper education of the majority of students. There are several ways that we invite you to participate in this fight. First, you can learn about the epidemic and the science behind fighting it on my website. You can sign up for my email newsletter. My team and I are currently working on putting together online courses to make more in-depth information widely available. As I mentioned, we have already created a mechanism for school leaders to take a proactive step towards changing norms by using the Nurturing is the Foundation policy framework. You can help us convince leaders that this is an important step by endorsing the resolution on the website. You can join Schools of Conscience by making generous monthly contributions to our work. Finally, if you do become a member, we will need help establishing and maintaining relationships with schools. Our intention is to reach out across all the usual political and ideological barriers that divide the factions in education. The next step for this project is to find an organization with the capacity to support it. This is a big task, and I want to partner with or license to an existing organization that can invest in the mission. This work is based on a few human universals that underlie all the surface variations in educational settings. The children do not care about our politics and our ideologies. They want to enjoy learning, and it turns out that they'll get more out of it when they do. Nurturing is the key to both enjoyment and the excellent learning that follows from it. In part 2, I will go into more detail on the model we use in our fight against the epidemic of disengagement and how that model fits into the bigger picture. I will also revisit the portrayal of the delinquents and outcasts in Hollywood movies. The psychology of learning and the tools we're using to fight the epidemic can help us more productively connect the stories that Hollywood tells about schools to the reality of how students and teachers live in schools.